Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today, I want to talk to you folks about a real outlaw in the world of comics. He started his career as a horror artist, but he didn't just draw horror, he drew lurid, sensationalistic horror. Then he moved into becoming a publisher of comics and magazines, publishing real tabloid, schlocky stuff. This was a guy who got involved in lawsuits and legal threats with both Marvel and DC. This guy was out there. He was known for pistol whipping his business partner in front of the entire staff at the office. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the wild career of Myron Fass. Myron Fass was born in Brooklyn in 1926, and by the time he was 22, he was working as an artist on comics for a wide swath of the new comics publishers that debuted in the late 30s and early 40s. Fass drew for publishers like Lev Gleason and Toby on westerns and romances. In the world of Western comics, Fass was one of the artists on John Wayne Adventures, working alongside such superstars as Al Williamson. But if anyone noticed his artwork, it was most likely to be on his horror stuff. Fass was smart enough to sign his name on the first page of most of his stories in an era where credits weren't common. While his work may not quite compare to the depth and detail of the best horror comics that EC was producing at the time, such as something by Johnny Craig, for example, Myron's art was still clear and atmospheric, better than average. This cover, for instance, where he drew himself about to be attacked by monsters, is pretty engaging. Fass worked on various horror titles until the Comics Code Authority was established in 1955, effectively shutting down a lot of horror comics and publishers. Fass exited the business as an artist. With comics under the obligation to follow the Comics Code, which wouldn't allow various monsters, drugs, and certain forms of violence, Fass opted to become a magazine publisher in 1956. Magazines weren't kept to the same rules. The first book Fass put together was Lunatical. He packaged that, bringing the talent together for Fawcett to publish. Fawcett was best known for creating the original Captain Marvel, but at the time, Fawcett's finances were on the downhill trend, and they opted to stop making superhero comics and get into other areas. Lunatical was a knockoff of Mad Magazine, which had debuted from EC Comics back in 1952. The first issue of Lunatical featured some great artists, and Fass claimed it sold 1 million copies. The second issue included a clever satire of the Comics Code business interrupting comics. But sales dropped, and the third issue never came out. Soon, Fass was editing and putting together cheap magazines like Photorama and Shock Tales. Fass correctly realized that things like girly magazines and horror would always sell well. And he realized that as long as you had a decent cover, it didn't exactly matter what was inside. In fact, he was known for using the cheapest newsprint possible on the interiors. Things like fact-checking, quality control, and good taste were all left at the front door. Fass's earliest publishing efforts were financially backed by William Harris, who had invented the Harris printing press. Fass specialized in launching multiple pin-up and nudie magazines, as well as tabloid news magazines. Not all of these titles lasted long, and at one point, Fass had as many as 50 magazines in print in a single month. His standard was, if it could sell 20,000 copies, he'd print it, and it didn't matter what was inside. Fass was focused on magazines and wouldn't add comics into that portfolio until the mid-60s. In 1957, Warren Publishing started up and created the best-selling horror comics of their day. They did this in black and white magazine format, with popular titles such as Creepy and Eerie. Among their most enduring characters was Vampirella. Fass took notice of this and eventually launched Eerie Publications in 1966 alongside Stanley Harris, the son of William Harris. The publisher's name was absolutely intentional, so as to confuse readers who were picking up Eerie magazine. Fass's horror titles all sounded similar to old EC horror comics such as Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. Fass published books like Horror Tales, Tales from the Tomb, Terror Tales, and Witches' Tales. Some of the interior art was original, but Fass figured out a way to keep costs down. He would also obtain old Golden Age artwork and have it reworked into new pages. It was fast and cheap, and I'm sure the original artists never even heard about the art being reused, let alone received any payment. Between his schlocky magazines about UFOs and guns, Fass continued to crank out horror magazines reusing all sorts of previously existing artwork. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that while his horror titles featured knockoff cover art designed to look like the competition, the interior work was often literally plagiarized. While nobody sued Fass for his offensive content or his creative reuse of old artwork, he did eventually attract legal attention from both Marvel and DC Comics when he decided to enter the superhero game in 1966. Captain Marvel was a famous name that was not being used at the time, so Myron Fass teamed up with comic book creator Carl Burgos to create a new version of Captain Marvel. Let's talk a little bit about Captain Marvel's history. In 1939, Fawcett Comics developed a superhero book. Staff writer Bill Parker had an idea for a team of 6 superheroes granted powers by mythological figures. Executive director Ralph Day suggested combining that into one hero. Staff artist C.C. Beck illustrated an ash can version of Captain Marvel that was printed off in 1939 to secure Fawcett's copyright on the idea, and the character debuted to the public in Whiz Comics #2 from February of 1940. It was a popular book. There was a Hollywood serial made in 1941. That was enough attention for DC Comics to issue a lawsuit, suing Fawcett for infringing on their character of Superman. Ultimately, Fawcett won that lawsuit, but the case took 10 years and severely depleted Fawcett's finances. DC appealed the verdict, and Fawcett had no choice but to settle with DC, agreeing to stop publishing Captain Marvel by 1953. On a somewhat related note, the small British publisher L. Miller & Son published black and white reprints of Captain Marvel from 1945 up until Fawcett stopped publishing Captain Marvel in 1953. In order to continue making comics, the publisher hired Mick Anglo to come up with a replacement character. This was a thinly veiled character called Marvel Man. This character was revived in the 80s with writer Alan Moore and imported to the US as Miracle Man. But jumping back to Myron Fass, he began making his horror comic magazines in 1966, and that same year he decided to try to make superhero comics. He figured since no one was using the Captain Marvel name, he would. Carl Burgos created this new character with the old name. Burgos had created Human Torch for Marvel Comics. In Alter Ego issue 49, Burgos' daughter was interviewed about his career, and she stated that Burgos had tried to sue Marvel for ownership of Human Torch when they began using it in Fantastic Four. But nothing came of the lawsuit, and he threw out all of his old Marvel comics in 1966. Perhaps creating a character with Marvel in his name was Burgos attempting to get back at Marvel Comics, but if so, it didn't work out very well. By all accounts, the reviews and sales on Myron Fass's Captain Marvel were abysmal. This version was an alien android who could break off any body part at will by yelling "split," and then bring them back to him by yelling the nonsensical word "Zam." The art was not very exciting, and the character was not engaging. It lasted 4 issues and 2 annuals. On top of taking the name Captain Marvel, Fass used another superhero name he thought was available. Issue 1 says it includes Plastic Man. This version of Plastic Man was a villain, and in his appearance in issue 2, his name is changed to Elastic Man. Issue 2 introduced a character named Dr. Fate, and issue 3 introduced a character called the Bat. DC Comics threatened legal action, which resulted in Plastic Man changing to Elastic Man and the Bat changing to the Ray. Marvel's publisher, Martin Goodman, noted a comic prominently using the word Marvel and got his lawyers involved. That led to Marvel quickly inventing their new character, Captain Marvel, an alien Kree warrior sent to Earth. This version was created by Stan Lee and Gene Colan and debuted in the anthology title Marvel's Superheroes number 12 at the end of 1967, just as Myron Fass's comics were ending. The story was apparently important enough for the New York Times to cover. Never one to leave money on the table, Fass sued Marvel Comics over the name, but this was quickly settled out of court, and Marvel has maintained the trademark on the name Captain Marvel by keeping a version of their comic in print ever since. But with the failure of Captain Marvel for Fass, he quickly exited the comic book publishing world at the end of 1967. He continued to publish the horror comics in magazine format through Eerie Publications through 1981. In 1977, he tried to get into sci-fi comics with Gasm. That was clearly intended to capitalize on the popularity of more adult comics anthologies like Heavy Metal and Epic, but it only lasted 5 issues. Fass would always have a fairly eye-catching cover, but the interior art was rarely to the same standard. Fass lost his business partner Stanley Harris in 1976. Not only did they argue, but according to editor Jeff Goodman, the two literally got in a fist fight at work, which Fass won. The argument was over how Fass insisted on talking with their distributors directly and not allowing any other employees to speak with them. Harris sued Fass, but I couldn't find the actual lawsuit to find the details on how that played out. What I could find was a quote from Harris where he said that Fass would walk around the office with a gun in his hip holster to intimidate the staff. There was a famous quote by editor Jeff Goodman where he said that, yeah, one time Myron Fass literally shot through the wall of the offices. Now, Fass defended himself by saying, hey, he published gun magazines and he had to have a gun with him so that he could be familiar with his subject matter. After Harris left Fass, he started his own publishing company that would go on to buy Warren assets like Vampirella and publish that in the 90s. He also had successful magazines like Guitar World. Meanwhile, Fass set up another magazine publisher and continued to publish tabloid magazines, gun magazines, UFO magazines, and one-offs about celebrity deaths. Apparently, Fass became more weird and paranoid as the years went on. He moved from the New York area to Ocala, Florida to publish magazines and run a gun store. He also changed his name to Chief Marion Riley Fass. Fass was out there on the edge. I can't really recommend his Captain Marvel comic. It's pretty bad. But if you're curious about his work, there are books that focus on his horror comics. For instance, The Weird World of Eerie Publications by Mike Howlett. There are also anthology reprints of those horror books easily available at bookstores and online. Fass's lasting legacy for comics fans is likely to be those horror comic magazines, although he published a lot more tabloid and schlock for magazines. But you have to respect that Fass at least was a hardcore entrepreneur. He started up a lot of companies and he had a singular drive to achieve his version of success. The only thing that held him back was likely that same drive, because he wouldn't trust others to help him along the way. He isolated himself from his business partner and eventually a lot of his staff and lived a pretty lonely, quiet existence in his final few years. So, let's let that be a lesson to all of us. Creativity and drive will take you far, but to go all the way and have continued success, you should probably work on some of your people skills. Folks, thanks so much for watching this episode. I'll be back next week with another Comic Tropes episode. If you enjoyed it, please, things like hitting like and subscribe really help this channel to find a bigger new audience. I appreciate your help with that. And if you want to support the channel, there are links in the description below where you can find things like Patreon, you could join this channel on YouTube, you could donate a one-time tip, or you can even follow my second channel, which is called Pros and Cons. It has a weekly live show where I recap all the comic book news and the reviews of the week. Thanks so much for watching. Cannot wait to see you next time. And until then, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.